All right, so the last couple lectures, hopefully we've introduced to you some of concepts in ethics. Again, I'm aware that most of you don't come out of a long philosophical background, so you haven't already spent hundreds of hours contemplating the finer points, but like I attempted to convey the last couple lectures, I don't think that that the details of ethics are actually that hard to understand. By being a human alive in the world, interacting with other people, you are gaining all sorts of experience. And so sometimes in the world of ethics, the question comes up: what is ethical expertise? What is it? If you take a certain amount of training and take on this label called ethicist, what is that training? What does it qualify you to do that other people can't? Usually with the sensibility that people realize they have maneuvered ethically their entire lives, and it's hard to imagine what special training is going to make that easier. And to that I respond that the ethicist has no special insight on which ethical methods are the best. What they could claim to have would be experience in working with people facing ethical issues. And as sort of 10 examples of that turns into 100, turns into 1,000, it's the experience of what people go through as they're trying to make tough decisions, or trying to, and when I say tough decisions, I'm thinking clinical decisions at the bedside, or even when they're thinking about larger policy decisions, what should the rules be? Or when they're experiencing moral distress, the anxiety of seeing something that seems like it's not as it should be. I think if clinical ethics is to make an impact as a field, it isn't a particular ethics expertise, it's experience with people going through the rigmarole of life, which throws a bunch of tough questions at you. So that's, and I think the profession of ethics, which still remains an unregulated health profession, not really officially, so that in some ways the jury is still out as to what exactly the role of this job is. But I've often described it as attempting to offer increased peace of mind to clinicians and researchers. Because very often the ethical decisions they face, they do their best. Hopefully they've got a bunch of close colleagues that they share, should I do this or should I do that with. But for many of them, I think encountering an ethics service, an individual or a group of people who are really going to go through the pros and cons, is designed to make them more confident in whatever they decide. And the value of that is to hopefully reduce a little bit of that anxiety, which we know within healthcare systems is a bit of a problem. A lot of the people that work here seem to be a little bit more stressed and anxious than others. That's part of why tomorrow afternoon you can go to the future and all that jazz and unwind a bit.
Yeah. Why not?
Directly or indirectly.
Yeah.
If this class doesn't help you unwind enough already. So just to review again, I think, as I told you last time, Dr. Solas has given me the great pleasure of being able to cook up a couple of test questions around ethics. Again, they're not going to be tough ones, they're just see if you're sort of listening to what your options are. So do the ends justify the means? That just gets you thinking about the basics being there are rules and laws, conventions. In medicine, sometimes they're called standards of practice, but those would be the means that we get there. The ends are the outcomes of whatever we decide to do. And so, like I've said, really good decisions hopefully exemplify good principles, good rules, but also with an eye steeped in logic and rationality that you want a good outcome. So an example of a common ethical question is emerges when a doctor or a researcher perceives, possibly accurately, that following the rules or the standards is not going to lead to the positive outcome that you're hoping for. So a bunch of ethical questions are around how much is it okay, or when is it okay to stretch rules or bend rules or break rules for the sake of what you think is going to be a better outcome. And that's often not an easy thing to decide. And when you meet lots of people, you realize that there is almost a certain innate nature that many people have, that they're rules people or they're outcomes people. And they may not necessarily know that about themselves, but sometimes when people are in fact rules people, for them the thing to do is whatever you can say, I followed the black and white written version of what it says I'm supposed to do. And then somebody says, well, didn't you see that in this case it's probably going to lead to an outcome that's less than positive? And they might have said, I don't think that way. To me it's about following the rules. What I'm really worried about, I don't really know often what the outcome's going to be, but I know that if I deviate from standard, somebody might be upset about that. So again, I think part of the challenge of ethics is figuring out where are the exceptions, where, when does it really make sense to pursue the good outcome, or what you think is going to lead to a good outcome, and cut corners. So principle-based decision-making, I gave you the basic principles, but just a reminder that, so how do you use them? You use the principles to think deductively. I want to respect this person's autonomy. I want to do good for them. I don't want to harm them, and I want to treat them fairly. And you can ask such questions about this person and probably answer them. And when the principles work well as a problem-solving method, it'll jump out at you that, well, this principle of respecting what they say seems to be conflicting with the principle of not wanting to harm them. Because I have this hunch that if I do what they say, it's actually going to harm them. And so the ethical dilemma in the clinician is figuring out how to find the right balance. If they are encouraged to proceed with what the patient says they want, has the patient really accepted the risk that you see? Because that's the key of the consent process, that yes, I understand risk and I accept it. And it's important to have that understanding so that after the fact, whatever happens, you'll be able to live with yourself better, as opposed to second guessing yourself, saying, I should have pushed that person harder. They were telling me what they want, I saw what was going to happen, I mentioned it, but not enough. So a lot of this good ethical process to make good decisions has the real goal of lightening your burden after the fact, especially after things don't necessarily turn out as hoped. So again, the principle, this is what I want you to be aware of when it comes to ethical method. Outcomes-based decision-making, again, that's where you sort of throw the principles out. You decide that my approach to the ethical question, what shall we do, is going to be based on our best guess of what outcome will emerge. And then you have some means of assessing that outcome. And when you think about means of assessing outcomes, it's sort of, well, we've got this good effect and this good effect. You've got to ask yourself, well, how good? Can we give some quantity to that level of goodness? And then can we measure that against the risks or the possible harms? And so there really is this, usually implied calculus, a calculation that you make of goods and harms. But often that isn't necessarily so easy to do, because these things are not entirely quantifiable, and they're not predictable, even if they were. So then to remind you of rights, duties, and laws. So these are part of the, I guess, the map of ethical theory. I think I mentioned, I'll mention again that rights, human rights, patient rights, are definitely an innovation in ethical discussion over the last century or two. The recognition of a minimum standard to which people are entitled. If it's human rights, we would say every human being. We like to use the word inalienable, meaning they can't be taken away. We sort of declare that everybody has these. When you look at the world, it's pretty easy to see that the rights we think that everybody has aren't necessarily being respected or fulfilled, that it's still aspirational. But I don't want you to miss how important that innovation is. Okay, at the same time, if you're looking to ethics as a method for solving problems, rights language isn't necessarily the first thing I would go to, where it's just, well, the patient has the right to do that, I have the right to do this, the physician or the nurse or the scientist has the right to practice in their way. And so these discussions of competing rights, in my experience, don't necessarily lead to good outcomes. I would encourage, in that moment, to perhaps speak about duties. What are the duties of each person? When you think about duties and rights, if you claim that somebody has a right to something, you're implying that somebody else has a duty to provide so that that right is fulfilled. And it's a more potentially productive discussion if you start talking about the duties of a professional, if it's a doctor or nurse in clinical care, the duties of a researcher if it's in a subject or a research trial. It has a better chance of leading to a productive discussion, even though it is logically related to the rights discussion. Laws, so just the relationship between ethics and law. I think you can look at law as the current consensus within society of what the general rules are. That's what our legal system does. We do our best to make these rules, tell people that they should abide by them, encourage them to do the right thing by warning them that if they transgress, they might get into some sort of trouble. And the whole thinking is that it actually helps people do the right thing. What we know is that laws are necessarily broad strokes, and if you've got a specific question of what I should do, looking to the book where the laws are written, there's a good chance it isn't going to answer your question. It might tell you something about what's legal and what isn't, but it isn't necessarily going to give you all of the other information. Good, bad, right or wrong, helpful or not. So the other thing about laws is that they are intended to be dynamic, that they're not fixed for all time. It's not, we've sort of got these old sets of laws that are often in religious scriptures that might be thousands of years old and are deemed as unchangeable. The current laws of nation states generally are reviewed, and while we're very fond of applying them, applying the current law, there's also always this process that if we find the law isn't quite hitting the mark, we can adjust it. And we do that with ethical thinking. We sort of see the impact of the law. We would then take the principles of ethics and see, well, what principles does this law base itself on? What outcomes in the real world does it tend to produce? And based on our assessment of good or bad, we're free to adjust laws. So in some ways, the law looms out there. Don't violate it. But if we really want to figure out what we ought to do with new technologies or how to even solve challenging questions, I think we need to turn first to the resources of ethics and only later to the law. So that's That's sort of the relationship. Narrative ethics, I'll remind you, is about the story, and it's the story of individuals as well as the story of cultures. So the question I'm about to ask you about how long should the human lifespan be in the face of new technology that can extend it, you should think not just of the stories of individuals, because that's going to be important. You can predict that a lot of individuals are saying, I wouldn't mind some extra life. But you also have to think of the story of the wider culture, the city, the province, the country, the world. And it's pretty predictable that if it's just, do you want extra life, people will say yes. But then you really have to think of the outcomes, what is likely to happen in the world. If all of us were all of a sudden to live for twice as long or 10 times longer. So narrative ethics is that method of asking, what's the relevant story? Can I tell it to myself, or can I get somebody to tell me? And the action is that in the telling of the story, you might gain sensibilities about what's better or worse, all things considered. And then the last two is the acceptance that whatever our analysis is, we're going to end up with some sort of compromise between possibilities. So seeking out the middle path would be yet another means of ethical method. So that's often described originally by Aristotle, that the best type of behavior is the medium between two extremes. And if you can figure out what that is, it's probably the best way to behave. And then wide reflective equilibrium is that feeling of being somewhat settled that you're supposed to get after you've done this ethical analysis, consideration, talking, listening to the stories, telling the stories. Equilibrium is that state that means you're ready to make a decision. So with that reminder, you now have to go to work. Congratulations, you have been invited to the ethics committee. So we are an ethics committee of sorts. We've got a meeting to discuss this issue, and towards the end of it, you're going to have to give an opinion. So here's the scenario. A researcher has discovered a new procedure in which genes associated with the aging of human cells can be adjusted to slow down the process. Again, I'm just imagining how might it work. And you hear a lot about genetic discovery of this or that gene associated with aging. And we can probably guess there's more than one gene associated with aging, but who knows how it's going to happen. Animal studies indicate that with a simple injection, lifespan can be doubled. That with a series of such injections seem to be able to increase lifespan tenfold. You're part of a committee charged with making recommendations about whether and how this new technology should be made available. Any questions about the scenario? Okay, so at this moment, you've internalized the question. I want to turn back to ethical method and say that the first thing that happens in ethical analysis is a gut reaction. Okay, so one of the things, I don't think it's unreasonable for us to pay some attention to our gut reactions. One of the things that really good self-knowledge does is tell you whether you ought to trust your gut reaction or not. If you know yourself really well and then you seem to put in your foot in your mouth, twice a month with regularity, it might give you pause to think that maybe my gut reaction isn't serving me well. And before I jump to any conclusions, I should employ some of these methods to modify my reaction. So, so that's the scenario, and so I'll give some comments, but we are going to ask each of you what you think ought to be done. So again, one shot, double your lifespan. So we'll say 150-ish. But then you can get it again and, and again, conceivably live somewhere to about 1,000 years. So, it is kind of tough to get your head around that in the real world, but that's the ask. So let's just, I'm just gonna offer some thoughts, and feel free to jump in if you've got any additional things. So if our only principle is respect for autonomy, so that would basically say, this isn't really a tough ethical question. If the only principle is respecting what autonomous people want, all people need to do is demonstrate that they understand what's going on, and therefore that their opinion reflects their autonomous wish. And if that's the only criterion, we can bet that a lot of people would say yes. I'm trying to imagine the few people that would inevitably say no. I mean, just ruling out people who are unhappy or depressed and just longing for the end of their life anyway. But would people immediately, because they think that if everybody lived for so long, there's going to be a real price to pay for humanity, would they volunteer? I don't need that. I don't think that a lot of people would choose that, at least not initially, until maybe they saw some of the effects of people that never died and growing population potentially out of control. So beneficence, what would be the good for humans pursuing this? So when you invoke beneficence, what is the good? There's often, the good according to whom? The good for an individual or the good for a larger group. I don't know, I think like so many of these, it's pretty hard to figure out what exactly would be good or not. I think that for healthy individuals that are well connected, life is hopefully enjoyable, and more of it is better. Being able to see not just your grandchildren and great-grandchildren, but your great-grandchildren's grandchildren. You can imagine that it's just a bigger, happier family. The flip side is, does your family then become too big? And as some might say, when you've got a super large family, you can't develop close relationships because there's literally 60 people between your eight brothers and sisters and their very large families, that somehow you don't get that personal interaction. But then other things, would it be good for people to live longer? I don't know, have any of you ever heard the idea that the fear of death, or the knowledge that we humans are finite, is one of the major things that drives us to do stuff in life. That we know the clock is ticking. We know that on some level that death is going to be the great unknown, that all of us have some appropriate fear about. But is it actually fundamental to human existence? So the first thing I worry about is if all of a sudden death was no longer, the one thing that is mandatory, that there's no escaping it, that all of us are going there. Once that becomes not necessarily the case, does it fundamentally change the human condition? In these 70 or 80 years that we typically fill. Pretty hard question to answer, but a good argument to be made that yes, we humans, our mortality is very important to how we organize our lives. And if you were to decide that we're going to double lives or make them way longer, you have to ask a whole bunch of questions. Is it really going to benefit, or are there unknown harms? So if you then went to non-maleficence, you see pretty quickly that beneficence and non-maleficence, wanting to do good and wanting to minimize harm, are pretty logically related. So often you're sort of dealing with those two principles together. Very often before you get to the other principles, you've got to sort out, well, what are the harms and benefits of this intervention? And then, so in some ways, it's the same discussion as the goods discussion. What are the harms? Or potential harms? So the fourth principle, justice, if we just say we want everything to be fair, you might then evaluate whether it's good to proceed with this based on, will it make the world a fairer place? Will the good be able to be distributed in a way that upholds a sense of justice? One of the interesting things about justice theory are are people who justify the existence of injustice. The first person I think about would be the American philosopher John Rawls, whose most famous book is called A Theory of Justice. And one of the basic outcomes from his book is that we can't necessarily achieve perfect justice. He said that injustice in systems is necessary, and knowing that, we can justify systems as long as those injustices in the end lead towards a benefit to those people who are disadvantaged, who are potentially the victims. And so in some ways you could say that Rawls is trying to explain the American system and saying that in the end, the existence of a whole super wealthy class, if that super wealthy class uses their resources well, they can actually bring benefits to the so-called less advantaged. And so, many Americans would argue that the competitive system that enables some people to excel and some to be left behind ends up breeding innovation, allowing really talented people to fully explore their talents and not be held back because it's somehow unfair that other people don't get that opportunity. But the argument is that the net benefit for all of humanity will clearly be there. That's why it's better for us to not necessarily create a system where everybody gets exactly the same. So these four principles apply to this question. I'm not sure that they answer it. So let's go to the next. All of these, in a way, are thought experiments. So how might the good be defined in such a challenge? And this is where, as I intimated recently, it's hard to know what the ultimate good for human beings is. More intelligence, less illness, more less fights and depression. Is it more happiness? If you ever do find the time to take a regular philosophy class, you might be led to those discussions. Well, what is human life about? And there's this theory called hedonism, that really we humans are just about trying to make ourselves happy, in a small local way and in a general way. And most of human life is trying to serve that. How do we make ourselves a little bit happier, a little bit more content? And so others would say, well, we need to make people a little bit smarter, or a little bit better, or a little bit stronger. And like I suggested last week, there's always the question, and what then? And so if everybody is smarter, if we can, if the pill isn't to lengthen your life, but to raise your IQ by 20 points, we might think that's a great thing. But maybe then everybody with a 20-point higher IQ, we literally can't find people to pick fruit off trees because everybody thinks that type of work is beneath them. So with the extra points, you go invent a fruit-picking robot, and we're done with that. So in some ways, that's part of the challenge of the future. I think you've got pretty good reason to believe that our computers and the robots connected to them will indeed be able to do a huge amount of the standard labor that's done. I don't know how quick that will be, but you can imagine that lots and lots of labor-intensive jobs will be eliminated 10, 20, 100 years from now. And then there's the question of how will people fill their day? I don't know, do any of you see yourselves as true hounds of leisure that would have no problem filling your day if you didn't have to have a job. So, I mean, one thing we've noticed, or I've noticed, is that most people who might achieve that initial dream that so many people have of financial security. So say you've got $5 or $10 million in the bank, and pretty sure you're going to be able to pay all of your bills. The vast majority of those people don't simply become idle and live a life of leisure. They tend to want to find at least something to do. So on top of the possibilities of what is human life for, we could say in general, people are searching for meaning, not to merely exist, but to contribute in some small way to the collective human enterprise. Sometimes I think we haven't done enough in the sort of emerging secular world to define the things that might be meaningful in life. And I think some of the older, more traditional parts of the world, that are steeped in traditional religion, can't even imagine how secular people, without a sense of the presence of the divine, can find meaning in their life. Whereas I think that the so-called secular masses, for the most part, do find meaning. They don't necessarily give it a clear label. But like I suggested last time, I think it's always some combination of overcoming the isolation of the individual, bonding with some other person or people in some endeavor, and hopefully slowly contributing in some way to the world, even if that's merely sharing a joke and a laugh. So just when you get back to the doing ethics by outcomes, it's very important when we're discussing such a tough issue. Shall we make this pill available to people? Shall we hold it back? To do as good a job as we can of estimating what's likely to happen, recognizing the limits of that. So again, the stories that are relevant, there are multiple stories going on in every one of our lives. We're a member of a culture, a religion, a nation, a city, a neighborhood, a few clubs, sports teams, interest groups. All of us have these multiple connections. Trying to imagine the stories that would unfold within families when people no longer had to die. My parents are, I'm in my 50s, I got parents in their 80s. It seems that things are, to some degree, as they've always been. My parents in their 80s are still relatively young, they're not hospitalized or anything, and so maintain that sort of power. I notice that there often comes a point when the elderly seem to become more dependent on their older, their grown kids, but I still feel like they're the parents and I'm the kid. And you wonder what it would be like, if one of them were to have a stroke, and then be hospitalized and dependent. Would I then really have to grow up and assume the parental role? And then you can extend those questions of, well, what does family life and relationship become when death is optional, not mandatory? Are you really able to generate as much care and love for your great-great-grandchildren as for your grandchildren? And if not, is that a problem? Again, I imagine that the farther the generations get away, although I think most people would have this natural love for their great-great-grandchildren as much as their grandchildren. It's hard to figure out exactly how that all works in a world of immortal people, how it would work and how it should work. So as you're considering your answer to this question, do your best to pay attention to your gut reaction. What do you think about the rules and the principles and the outcomes? Are there stories of what human beings do and tend to do and should do that would be affected by this long lifespan? So again, I imagine the story of typical family life, and I have this hunch that, that death being inevitable and unavoidable is one of the main things that has created typical human attitudes. And I really worry that things would go badly in unexpected ways if it became, if lifespan became 1,000 years. So I've given you some options. Just a reminder of the precautionary principle. This is the idea that looms, especially in the ethics of the future, that any activity that raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. So this is basically the idea that some people would say, well, if you guys are gonna say no to this technology because you fear that it will lead humanity in a bad direction, give us some proof of that. Prove to us that this cause will lead to this effect. And if you can't, well, then we're just gonna proceed because you haven't really proved that the harm exists. And so this is where I think that a lot of the things we worry about with future technologies, whether it's biogenetics and creating things we don't understand, we think they're gonna help, but we didn't understand the system well enough. Does it make sense to put a halt on some of these things? And that brings back to mind the Chinese geneticist who thought he's just gonna go ahead and tinker with the genes of this embryo. I assume in the hope that it turns out to be everything that he hoped for. He ends up being part of the end of HIV because of these things. That there are not, in fact, a bunch of other effects that he couldn't conceive of. But I don't know, I'm kind of persuaded sometimes by the precautionary principle that for some technologies, the more and more dangerous they get, the question is, well, what's the rush? If the harms or risks are astronomically remote, but totally catastrophic, does it really hurt to maybe wait a little century to see if we can make a better guess? And what might a compromise on such a thing or such a proposal look like? So, I think at this point we're going to turn it over to the class. Each of you can be asked what you think about this, and then discuss. So the question is, I'll go back to the scenario. What would you recommend, and what are your reasons? And then at the end, we'll maybe get your opinion as to whether you think this is a likely scenario, that there actually might be some committee somewhere in 10 or 20 years debating a question just like this. So to go back, a researcher has discovered a new procedure. Genes associated with the aging of human cells can be adjusted to slow down the process. Simple injection, lifespan can be doubled. In a series of such injections, you can make your life 10 times longer. Our committee is now going to discuss this and hopefully and see if we can make a recommendation as to what can be done. You guys ready? Any questions about what the question is? All right, I won't go geographical. I'll say would somebody like to share their gut reaction and their analysis first?
Alright, well, my first gut reaction is, if this was to actually be discovered, people would probably go to monetize it immediately.
In the current system, yeah.
Definitely. So I don't think we will reach any sort of full scarcity type society anytime soon.
Yeah, so the good news is that this committee is a pretty important committee. It's able to make some rules about the progress of this research. So I think there is no question that some people absolutely want to monetize it. So what are we going to tell them about
There might be, I suppose this might be my slight background in economics, but that might actually lead to a better solution than just letting absolutely everybody have it. Okay, let me explain my reasoning before, it's like a reckless capitalist. Let's see. First of all, there's a 95% chance that
Let's see.